Alan, good afternoon. Jeff in Las Vegas.
Jeff in Las Vegas, Alan in Woodland Hills. How are you?
I love Woodland Hills. I know it well.
Good, good, good. Yeah, I've lived here quite some time.
I'm a native here too. So I am so excited to talk to you about Dr. X today at the premiering of the Turner Classic Movies Film Festival this year. Michael Curtiz, I'm a film buff, film historian, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, The Seahawk, my personal favorite, Mildred Pierce. But people don't know him for his three horror films. I've seen The Walking Dead and Dr. X. And so what makes his horror films so unique that stand out among his other classic films that more people know about?
Well, I think his horror films get overlooked because they were made during a period when he was starting a new film like every 3 months. I mean, if you look at Curtiz's output between 1932 and 1933, I think there were like 15 films. He was just making a film one after another after another. And I think some of it gets lost in the wash. I think the other thing is both Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum have been, were gone for so many years, hidden. They found the Wax Museum print, quote unquote, in Jack Warner's vault, which, Jack Warner didn't have a vault in his home like Al Capone. It was some part of the Warner where Warner stored films that they found this print. And now that both of those films have been restored by the UCLA Film and Television Archive and put out on Blu-ray by the Warner Archive Collection, I think they're winning an entire new audience. And I'm really happy that TCM is showing Dr. X on the opening night of their festival. And they have a little 7-minute piece by me talking about Curtiz and his horror films. So it's all good.
It's just really unusual because when you think of Warner Brothers, especially in the 30s, you think of their gangster films. But here, how can they compete with Universal in 1932 with their horror films?
Well, I think if you look at Dr. X, you have a typical Warner Brothers newspaper film. You have Lee Tracy as the prototypical smart aleck reporter, and Fay Wray. There's a little love story there, and all of that going on. So you have the Warner House style, the ripped from the headline style of 5-star final and all of that Darryl Zanuck created. And you have that melded into a horror movie using 2-strip Technicolor, because Jack Warner had a contract with Technicolor that needed to be fulfilled. And musicals were temporarily out of season, out of fashion, and they didn't know what else to do. And the other thing was, economically, the Depression was forcing some of the big five into receivership. Theaters were closing. They needed to get people in. So they got on the horror bandwagon, but it was a short ride. Jack Warner did not like horror films. He didn't like films about drunks, and he didn't like horror films, period. And he was, some part of it was economic. He didn't want to offend exhibitors, where Warner's had a lot of theaters in the rural areas of the country. But Zanuck was head of production from the time he was 25 years old. They had this property, The Terror. They decided to make this film, use the Technicolor, and try to make something really gruesome that would get people into theaters. But yet at the same time, they hedged their bets because they had the Lee Tracy bumping into skeletons. I think I said in my commentary, it reminded me of an East Side Kids movie with the kind of goofy type of hijinks, and to try and leaven that. And what's interesting is, we're sitting here 90 years later and we're watching this thing and watching this movie in our living room and saying, that's good and this and that. 90 years ago, people were not nearly as sophisticated, and they're sitting in the dark watching, a human heart in a beaker with Preston Foster in a lab jacket with blood all over it and smearing synthetic flesh on this. This was really scary. And the contemporary reviewers said, even though they said, well, the comedy stuff is really corny, but people who were frightened were now nervously giggling. So I think there was an intent on how they made this movie. And I think some of the people that are critical of the goofiness and the slapstick that's in there, you have to look at that through the prism of the contemporary culture of 1932.
Well, you mentioned the horror aspect and the comedy aspect, but this was also pre-code Hollywood too, right? So it dealt with other issues that I think were more objective back then.
Oh yeah. Well, first off, talking about cannibalism, after Breen took over, Joseph Breen of the Production Control Authority, who became Hollywood's chief censor in like mid 1934, there was no more mention of cannibalism, even as late as the late 50s, early 60s, when they were making, Bill Castle was making Mr. Sardonicus. He got a letter from the head of the PCA saying, I think that there's something to do with cannibalism and you can't have that. And this was like, 30 years after the fact. So all of that went out. Fay Wray showing off her gams, putting on stockings. John Ray, who plays one of the scientists, he's basically cast as a horn dog with dirty magazines. And there was also a scene I found out where he kind of hands Fay Wray like a Kama Sutra manual and kind of leers at her. And I think Zanuck took that out because he didn't figure that was going to play even in the days before Joe Breen was censoring movies. So yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that content. What's really interesting is you see in Wax Museum, these other things, you have the maid played by Leela Bennett. She has a thing of Gordon's gin under her pillow, and they have a close-up of the Gordon's gin bottle. Well, alcohol was illegal. It was illegal to have alcohol, but everyone was doing it anyway. All making alcohol illegal, all it did was create the mafia. So yeah, there's a lot of that pre-code stuff that all of us love so dearly.
And of course, we have to mention the legendary family of the Westmores and the makeup and Max Factor. I mean, it's such a legacy, and you can see where it all began with Dr. X.
Yes, and I think I talked to Michael Blake, who I don't know if you know Michael, but he wrote the definitive biography of Lon Chaney Sr. He's a retired Hollywood makeup artist and actor. And he told me at this time, he thinks that that Purs Westmore created the synthetic flesh, but they had to go to Max Factor because in those days, Max Factor was the final word in makeup. And the makeup at the Hollywood studios wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it would become. So that makeup, the synthetic flesh, and all of that, I speculate in my commentary what it may be made of, but this was before the invention of foam rubber, for goodness sakes. So I think one of the uniqueness things of Dr. X is that it was making up a lot of stuff as they went along. They weren't copying things, they were making it up. And I think the horror films of Michael Curtiz, Dr. X, Mystery of the Wax Museum, and The Walking Dead, which is kind of Boris Karloff brought back to life in a Warner Brothers gangster film, it was kind of like a Rosetta Stone for so many horror films to follow, because they were making this stuff up and inventing it as they went along.
And I'm always fascinated as a memorabilia collector. Have you seen any original Dr. X posters? What do they go for? Are they rare?
They're rare. They're hideously expensive. My friend and colleague, Scott McQueen, who restored Dr. X, who knows more about Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum than anybody on how the movies were made. He interviewed Fay Wray way back in the day when he was a teenager about this. About these movies. He has several of those, and I've looked at them online. I have a lot of film noir posters, and this room has 8x10s that have been signed by, people who have come to my film festivals and people that I've known, and so on and so forth. And they're hideously expensive. They're as hideous as the movie. Probably, and a couple of the posters would cost more than it cost to make the movie.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, congratulations. What a great retrospective. And I can't wait to watch it with some friends as it premieres. And also your short documentary, also very informative. So thank you for your time, and we'll see you at the festival.
All right, Jeffrey, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me. See you at the movies.